President Biden saying that he will not supply weapons that Israel could use to launch an all-out operation in Rafah. During that interview with CNN, Biden explained that the U.S. is still committed to Israel's defense and would supply Iron Dome rocket interceptors and other defensive arms, but the president did add, if Israel goes into Rafah, quote, we're not going to supply the weapons and artillery shells used. The U.S. chose last week to pause a shipment of heavy bombs to Israel, with Biden saying Israel needs to do more to protect civilian lives in Gaza. Reaction coming in from Israel as Israel's security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir posting on social media after that announcement this message right here on your screen. He did say Hamas hearts Biden. Israel's UN envoy calling it, quote, very disappointing. Now, I do want to talk about all of this here and the latest developments out of the Middle East. Let's bring in Avi Melamed, former Israeli intelligence official and the founder of Inside the Middle East. Thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to be here with us.
Hello, Josh. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, first off, I do want to talk a little bit about those comments from Biden, obviously making headlines over the past several hours here. So what would be the significance in that Rafah operation if Biden were not to supply the weapons, the U.S. not supplying those weapons to Israel? What sort of impact does that have?
Well, Josh, I think there are very good reasons why to be concerned about the potential ramifications of that statement, because it may sound almost ironic, but it's not only damaging the United States' interest, it's not only damaging Israel's interest, it may also negatively radiate on the Palestinians in Gaza themselves. And let me explain shortly what are the reasons for that concern. First, that statement basically plays to the hand of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza Strip, and basically embolden his refusal. And by the way, it's ironic because at the same time in the Arab world, there is a growing demand from Sinwar and the leadership of Hamas to move towards a deal and to end the tragedy and the misery of the people of Gaza Strip. So this is one thing. The other thing is Biden's statement, though he condemned strongly the robust protest in the campuses in the States, it actually could be a backwind to the protesters, even to escalate their protest in the campuses. The third reason has to do with Netanyahu. One of the major, if not the major guiding line, in my view, of Netanyahu's policy vis-a-vis the war is the whole issue of his heritage. Netanyahu was very clearly stating time and again, saying, Israel will operate in Rafah, Israel will not stop the war until the hostages are back home, and Israel is committed to end Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. So right here, that statement actually cornered Netanyahu in a sense that he is under a lot of pressure of his right-wing partners in the coalition to move on with the plans. And so it may be that Biden's statements, ironically, will push Netanyahu further to the arms of the right-wing partners in the government. And basically, from a Netanyahu perspective, that could be something that could be guided by a political calculation, saying that, well, if I, Netanyahu, will stand against and confront the U.S. president, that will bolster my position politically with the inner Israeli political game field. And finally, most significant, Biden administration comes a day after a very serious statement by the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards in Iran, who basically threatened to expand the war against Israel, including imposing a naval siege in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. Biden's statements the next day is viewed very concerned, sort of speaking, by many of the United States allies in the region. And it's a little bit ironic because following the very active and very significant role of the United States in successfully intercepting the Iranian attack on Israel on April 14, that has been rehabilitating the declining image of the United States. So now, unfortunately, it seems like Biden's statements once again compromises that positive process, because allies of the United States in the region, Arab states who are seriously threatened by the Iranian regime, say to themselves, well, if Biden administration is kind of like throwing Israel under the bus in the time of war, how can we rely on this administration? I would say the bottom line of all these things is basically a major question that has to be asked: to what extent that statement, in the end of the day, meets the same goal that Biden himself was setting when he was clearly saying the ultimate goal of this war is to end Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. I'm afraid that this statement is not necessarily taking things towards that direction. And in fact, it may be counterproductive to United States strategic interest, to Israel's strategic interest, to United States regional allies' strategic interest, and not less significant, it will not necessarily alleviate the pressure on the people of Gaza Strip. It may exactly achieve the other counter outcome.
And I think this kind of says it all as you are seeing that reaction pour in. I read this a short time ago, but we did hear from Israel's security minister simply posting on Twitter or X and saying Hamas hearts Biden. Now, is all of this putting more of a strain on the relationship between the U.S. and Israel? Because we've seen the strain kind of increasing, so to speak, over the past several months.
Yes, I would definitely think so. Look, it's yet another level of these increasing tensions, as you mentioned before. This time it's kind of like almost an open rift, and it has to be very quickly repaired. In the Middle East terminology, if you are being viewed as a non-trusted partner, if you are being viewed as a partner that is not reliable to your own strategic interests, there is ramifications to that. I think that whoever gave President Biden that advice, actually, that was a bad advice. I think that it would have been much better to continue the practical dialogue between Israel and the United States beyond the scene and to coordinate what is exactly the right measures, the right path to move forward, bearing in mind that in the end of the day, both United States, Israel, major Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, they all have the shared goal, strategically speaking, and that is to eliminate Hamas' ability to continue and to dictate its radical agenda. Because continuing to do that is serving the Iranian regime, who is engaging this imperialist vision that dragged the region to havoc, destruction, and death, and also presents a very serious threat to the United States' interest. So unfortunately, I think that there is a reason to be concerned that Biden's statement may jeopardize the interest of the United States, Israel, major Arab states, and again, I want to emphasize the need of the Palestinians in Gaza themselves for stability.
The Rafah operation, officially speaking, has not begun here, but we do know that Israel has operated, so to speak, in Rafah. Do we know what sort of goals they've achieved so far?
Well, up until now, Israel has been, or at least openly stated, it has been operating, taking over the Rafah crossing. This is the crossing connecting Gaza Strip with Egypt. That crossing, by the way, that crossing was the first thing that Hamas burned down to the ground in 2007 when Hamas took control over Gaza Strip. By taking away control over the Rafah crossing, obviously this is, of course, first an Israeli signal to Hamas that he is no longer the sovereign in the area. And second, basically enables Israel another pressure card, sort of speaking, to put, both in the context of Hamas as well as in the context of the whole negotiation vis-a-vis the issue of the releasing of the hostages. So up until now, that was a very restrained, restricted, limited Israeli military operation, and which, by the way, which confront almost no resistance, sort of speaking, by Hamas. But obviously, the question, of course, is what's going to be next, particularly following the statement made by President Biden. So we'll have to watch and to see how things will evolve on the ground.
I want to talk a little bit more about the ceasefire deal that really isn't necessarily on the table. Hamas came up with this one that they talked about approving, but it was one that was not approved by Israel. Now, it does mention returning hostages, quote, dead or alive. Is that concerning for Israel overall when the conditions of the hostages are already unknown at this point?
It is a major concern. As you probably know, not so long ago, there has been statement by Israeli security services and agencies expressing a deep concern regarding the well-being of many of the hostages kept in Gaza Strip. This is a major source of concern. This is, of course, one of the things that puts additional pressure on the government to try and to reach a deal in order to bring back as much as possible, as soon as possible, hostages, and obviously as much as possible alive. But there is a lot of concern in Israel regarding the well-being of the hostages, and there are very good reasons to be concerned.
Do you see a ceasefire deal being reached at any point prior to that Rafah operation? At this point, Netanyahu has said that we are getting very close to the actual operation happening. Is it even possible that a ceasefire deal could be reached?
It may be, but again, there is so much ins and outs. There are so many factors involved. There are so many contradicting, conflicting interests of the players involved. It's very, very difficult to try to predict where things are heading exactly and what will be the timeline. I would say very cautiously that it might be that we will see now further movement towards an agreement, but again, I'm going back to Biden's statement, which makes me very concerned, because I'm concerned that that statement will embolden the refusal position and will toughen the position of Hamas, and particularly its leaders in Gaza Strip, and the ramifications of that may be in the context of delaying and postponing a possible ceasefire agreement.
I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on in northern Israel right now. We do know the fighting does continue at this hour between Israel and Hezbollah. That has been going on for quite a while. So I want to get your take on this. Is Israel essentially at war with Hezbollah? I do know that no war has officially been declared like we've seen against Hamas, but is Israel essentially at war with Hezbollah as well?
No, not formally. In terms of like formal definition, it's an intensive fight which kind of shifts from time to time to different level of intensity, but we are not in a war, formally speaking. But definitely there is a concern. The Israeli Minister of Defense just recently said there is a concern that things could deteriorate towards that direction. In the context of the Hezbollah, I think it's important to notice that in Lebanon itself, there is a consensus across the board, including, by the way, Shiite leaders, including, by the way, believe it or not, the former Secretary General of the Hezbollah, Subhi Tfaili. All of those people, Christians, Druze, Sunnis, Shiites in Lebanon, are basically expressing an enormous concern about the possibility that Hezbollah once again will drag Lebanon to a war. And the message in Lebanon to the Hezbollah is, you have kidnapped us in the service of Iran. That's enough for itself, bad. We don't need you now also to drag us to a devastating war that will basically result in the total disintegration of Lebanon. So this is one, I would say, major calculation of Hezbollah's and the Iranians in the context of the skirmish, the fights that goes on between Hezbollah and Israel along the northern border.
All right. Avi Melamed, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and break down the latest developments there out of the Middle East. Is there anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Well, again, I need to reemphasize what I'm always saying. That war should be viewed in the right proportions. And the right proportion is that is basically part of a larger power struggle, particularly the Iranian imperialist vision, which brings death, destruction, and havoc on the region. We saw the massive Iranian attack on Israel. We saw the catastrophe the Iranian caused in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. We saw how Iranian proxies are holding the world hostage, the Houthis. We saw how the Hamas and Islamic Jihad holding Israeli hostages and their own brothers and sisters, by the way, also hostages. I think all of those things should make the world really wake up and understand this is a very serious alarm, and it's time that calls for action to block the Iranian imperialist vision.
All right, Avi, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to be here with us. We appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for having me.